Moving to impeach. Lawmakers consider another impeachment of President Donald Trump. We have team coverage, including how the vice president responded to the possible use of the 25th Amendment. Real estate deal, why the Vatican Secretary of State is coming under scrutiny. And the answer to anxiety. Pope Francis has advice for the faithful who are going through difficult times. On EWTN News Nightly for Wednesday, January 13th, 2021. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. I'm Tracy Sable. As of this newscast taping, President Donald Trump is on the verge of becoming the first U.S. president to be impeached twice by the House of Representatives. It comes 1 week after he encouraged his supporters at a rally to fight against the presidential election results. What followed was a violent attack on the U.S. Capitol that left 5 people dead. Correspondent Mark Irons reports now from Capitol Hill. Mark?
Tracy, today the House is voting on just one article of impeachment, incitement of insurrection. House Democrats say the president is responsible for inciting his supporters to come here to the Capitol building and cause mayhem. A handful of Republicans agree, while the majority say that impeachment would only further divide the country. Well, it all made for a historic day here on Capitol Hill.
The House will be in order.
A day packed with unprecedented debate inside the House chamber, just 1 week removed from chaos in congressional halls.
And we know that the President of the United States incited this insurrection, this armed rebellion against our common country.
Following his election defeat, Democrats said the president spread falsehoods of fraud and then encouraged his supporters prior to the storming of the Capitol as Joe Biden's presidential victory was being certified.
It was a violent attempt to interrupt our democratic process.
Republicans argued the impeachment effort was rushed and will only hurt the nation.
I can think of no action the House can take that's more likely to further divide the American people.
Still, some GOP members voting to impeach, including Representative Liz Cheney, the daughter of former Vice President Dick Cheney. She says the president went too far. The president of the United States summoned this mob, assembled the mob, and lit the flame of this attack. Security on the Hill today exceptionally tight, beefed up by armed National Guard troops with secure perimeters set up and metal detector screenings required for lawmakers entering the House chamber. Members of both parties agree the nation needs to heal.
We desperately need to seek a path forward, healing for the American people.
Meanwhile, the FBI has warned of potential armed protest ahead of Inauguration Day, and it's unclear how a Senate impeachment trial would play out. According to reporting from the New York Times, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell thinks that the president did commit an impeachable offense, but now in a letter to colleagues, the Majority Leader said he has not decided how he would vote at a Senate impeachment trial. On Capitol Hill, Mark Irons, EWTN News Nightly.
President Donald Trump reportedly watched from the White House as the impeachment proceedings played out on live TV. Unlike the first time around, it is not clear what plan the president has to fight this impeachment. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reports. Owen?
Tonight, President Donald Trump remains in office with another week to go, watching the impeachment process unfold. Now, his Vice President, Mike Pence, did not seek to invoke the 25th Amendment, but after getting booted off of social media, President Trump is no doubt finding it harder to defend himself to the public.
As Vice President Mike Pence and Chief of Staff Mark Meadows arrived at the White House separately this morning, President Donald Trump's fate was once again in the hands of lawmakers. No longer able to comment on Twitter, and with YouTube the latest to pull the plug on him, President Trump said this in Texas about the push for a second impeachment.
The impeachment hoax is a continuation of the greatest and most vicious witch hunt in the history of our country.
Vice President Mike Pence's refusal to invoke the 25th Amendment may have bought the president more time. In a letter the vice president wrote to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, invoking the 25th Amendment in such a manner would set a terrible precedent. And he continued, I urge you and every member of Congress to avoid actions that would further divide and inflame the passions of the moment. Work with us to lower the temperature and unite our country. Meanwhile, the incoming administration continues to take shape.
I've asked Ambassador Samantha Power to serve as the next administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development.
In order to keep the United States secure, We need to invest in defense, diplomacy, and development.
There's already increased security around the White House, road closures, metal fencing, and concrete barriers. The vice president's home also fortified. Even Airbnb will cancel all short-term reservations in the nation's capital for the week of the inauguration.
Also tonight, President Trump released a statement through the White House press office saying in part, and I'll read it here, "I urge that there must be no violence, no law-breaking, and no vandalism of any kind. That is not what I stand for, and it is not what America stands for. I call on all Americans to help ease tensions and calm tempers." At the White House, Owen Jensen, EWTN News Nightly.
Vince Coglianese, editorial director at the Daily Caller, joins me now on Skype to talk about today's impeachment proceedings. Vince, welcome back. Always good to speak with you. Ahead of next week's transition of power, how is this discussion of impeachment, how is it affecting both President Trump and President-elect Biden? Let's talk about that.
Well, I think President Trump feels persecuted here. I mean, that was kind of evident, I think, in his statement that he gave from Texas in the last 24 hours, that he thinks this is a continuation of an effort to take him out. There's no question that over the course of his presidency, there has been an establishment effort really to knock him out, and definitely in the early days of his presidency to consider him a completely illegitimate president. That extended through actually much of his administration from his political opponents. On Joe Biden's side of the aisle, I think Joe Biden has a delicate dance here. One, he's trying to indulge the passions of his base of the Democrat Party, but also he has to realize that he's about to become president of the United States, not of a single party. And the message that he's been running on and the message he says he's going to present at the inauguration is one of unity. So his job at this moment is to figure out what is the best possible path forward to bring together all of the voices of this country in such a way that they can have faith that this government serves them.
Well, Vince, as you know, there are members of both parties who actually support impeachment, including Representative Liz Cheney, the third highest ranking Republican in the House. Can we talk about that and what you think that signifies for the GOP?
Well, it signifies that there's absolutely a split in the Republican Party right now about what the future is, and also a bit of a split on how to sort of get the base of the Republican Party together. I don't think that there's anyone who looked up on the events of last week and forgives them. Not a single person. That's across both parties in all of Washington. Everyone was very upset with what took place in the Capitol. And some Republicans have taken it a step further and demanded the impeachment of the president of the United States. Now, the counterpoint to that, and what many Republicans are saying, is this will only serve to inflame a country that's already been inflamed further. Last week's events in the Capitol were not the first instances of political violence that we've seen play out, especially over the last 4 years. Recall, the inauguration of President Trump in 2017 was accompanied by tons of street violence. Many businesses damaged throughout the city, a limousine set on fire right outside the Washington Post building, 200 people arrested for the rioting, and many cops were injured. Later on, of course, we saw the shooting of Republican congressmen on a baseball field in Alexandria, Virginia, including the grievous injuring of Steve Scalise, and that was done by a supporter of Bernie Sanders. There's just been far too much political violence in the country, and I think Washington needs to figure out how to take a step back and confront that and have cooler heads prevail.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people are talking about that. Bring the temperature down. Vince, as you know, also lawmakers, as you mentioned, from both parties are calling for accountability after last week's riots. But what form do you think that should take?
Well, the accountability, first and foremost, should be presented to the people who broke the law. Again, this is one of those areas where I don't think anybody disagrees. There's some disagreement over the way that we should consider that law breaking and how far we should take it. So, for instance, there are all sorts of laws that are already on the books regarding federal trespassing and breaking the law, and certainly injuring cops. Those things are all covered well by federal law and should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. We discourage that type of activity by actually enforcing the law wherever it's presented, regardless of political party. The problems come with some lawmakers, including people like Chuck Schumer, are trying to stretch the definitions even further to say that anyone who stood inside of the Capitol, this would include grandmas perhaps who were waving American flags, of which you can find pictures of that, people who did trespass in the Capitol but didn't seem to perpetrate any acts of violence themselves, they're being considered domestic terrorists by some corners of the Democrat Party and are being said that it should be added to the no-fly list. that is a debate that is moving very quickly without much nuance. And when it comes to the rights of American citizens, we should be careful before we start labeling them broadly domestic terrorists. So it is a tough conversation going on in Washington right now, but one that requires, I think, sober minds to actually move forward.
Absolutely. Vince, always appreciate you coming on. Thanks a bunch. Vince Coglianese, editorial director at the Daily Caller. Thanks again, Vince. One update to a story that we have been following. The U.S. government has carried out its first execution of a woman on death row in nearly 7 decades. Lisa Montgomery was given a lethal injection early this morning. It happened just hours after the Supreme Court cleared the way for the execution. She was convicted for the 2004 killing of a pregnant woman and stealing her baby. Her lawyers say that she suffered from mental illness after abuse as a child. The U.S. bishops this week again called for an end to executions and asked Congress to abolish the federal death penalty. While China is still a primary human rights concern in 2021, that is according to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, who also says China's mass detention of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang is the agency's chief focus in China. The Prime Minister of Ireland issues a formal state apology to the thousands of unmarried mothers and their babies who endured pain, shame, and stigma at church-run homes.
On behalf of the government, the state and its citizens, I apologise for the profound generational wrong visited upon Irish mothers and their children who ended up in a mother and baby home or a county home.
Michael Martin also says the stigma still remains for some of the victims and that the country must face up to the truth. Women in Ireland who became pregnant out of wedlock were sent to the homes for most of the 20th century. A long-awaited report shows that thousands of babies died. Catholics in Colombia are mourning the loss of the Bishop of the Diocese of Santa Marta, who died of COVID-19. Bishop Luis Adriana Pitriata Sandoval passed away Monday night. He is the first bishop in Colombia to die from the coronavirus. He was ordained a priest back in 1972. In 2004, Pope Francis appointed him Bishop of Santa Marta on Colombia's Caribbean coast. The Archbishop of Glasgow, Scotland, who tested positive for COVID-19 over Christmas, has died 2 days after his 70th birthday. Archbishop Philip Tartaglia died at his home today on the feast of St. Mungo, the patron saint of Glasgow. The Archdiocese says while he has been self-isolating after the positive COVID test, the cause of death is not clear. The Vatican started its COVID-19 vaccines today. The Vatican is offering the first vaccine to healthcare and public safety personnel and the elderly, as well as those who are in contact with the public the most. Vatican employees and their families under the Vatican healthcare system will also have the opportunity to receive the vaccine. Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson is not ruling out a tougher lockdown in England and tells Parliament the spread of the coronavirus is under constant review.
The lockdown measures that we have in place, combined with the Tier 4 measures that we were using, are starting to show signs of some effect, and we must take account of that too, Mr. Speaker, because nobody can doubt the serious damage that is done by lockdowns to people's mental health, to jobs, to livelihoods as well.
Boris Johnson also confirmed vaccination centers will be open 24 hours as soon as possible. Coming up, the Supreme Court issues a ruling on access to an abortion pill. The Supreme Court has reinstated the Food and Drug Administration's requirement that women obtain an abortion pill from a doctor in person. A federal judge had suspended the rule because of the COVID-19 pandemic in response to a lawsuit from the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and pro-abortion groups. Chief Justice John Roberts sided with the majority in the 6-3 decision and wrote in part, quote, "The question before us is not whether the requirements for dispensing mifepristone impose an undue burden on a woman's right to an abortion as a general matter. The question is instead whether the district court properly ordered the Food and Drug Administration to lift those established requirements because of the court's own evaluation of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Christina Francis, chair of the American Association of Pro-Life Obstetricians and Gynecologists, join me now on Skype to talk more about this. Dr. Francis, welcome back. Thank you so much for coming on the show. First off, I'd like to get your reaction to this ruling and its significance.
Absolutely. Well, we at AppLog applaud this common sense decision by the Supreme Court to return these regulations to how mifeprex, or the drug that causes a medication abortion, is dispensed. These regulations were put into place in order to protect women from this potentially very dangerous medication for them. And so, we were appalled, as many other people were, when a federal judge with no medical expertise whatsoever removed these restrictions, which again were put into place to protect women from the very real complications that they can face from this medication.
And as you know, since 2000, the Food and Drug Administration has required that the abortion pill be dispensed and administered in person. Can you talk a little bit about why that suggested protocol and the need for women to be monitored while taking these drugs? What are some of the adverse reactions?
Sure. So the REMS, or the risk evaluation and mitigation strategy, that were put into place when the FDA approved mifepristone were put there because this is a potentially dangerous medication. So women that take this medication can experience significant bleeding. They can experience life-threatening hemorrhage. There's also an increased risk of infection associated with this medication. And so that's why these restrictions were put into place, to monitor the use of this medication, to try and minimize the complications that are associated with mifepristone. We do know that medication abortions with mifepristone carry a 4 times higher rate of complications than do surgical abortions even. So the fact that we were talking about lifting these restrictions, especially during a time when many people are facing health crises, was just uncalled for. It goes against medical standards. And the other reason why it's important that a woman actually see a physician prior to receiving this medication is because there's many factors that play into her risks associated with taking this medication, one of which is how far along she is in her pregnancy. And so it's really important that she see a physician to determine exactly how far along she is. The medication is approved up to 10 weeks gestation in the U.S. However, we know that after about 8 weeks of gestation, with every week that she is farther along in her pregnancy, her risk of complications increases significantly. And so one of the significant concerns about women receiving this medication through the mail is that women could be much farther along in their pregnancy. We've already seen this happen in the UK, where women have been able to access this through the mail, that women much farther along in their pregnancies are taking this medication, and they can experience life-threatening complications even more so than a woman who takes it early in her pregnancy. And the other main reason why a woman needs to see a physician prior to taking it is to rule out an ectopic pregnancy, or pregnancy outside of the uterus, prior to taking this medicine.
We have about a minute left, but I want to quickly ask you, besides physical, can you talk also about the mental health implications of this? And also, is this ruling final, or could we see this in-person requirement change once the Biden administration is in place?
Absolutely. Well, women very definitely experience mental health side effects from abortions in general, but especially a medication abortion where they're having to pass their baby at home along with really heavy bleeding. And I personally have talked to patients who weren't expecting that, and just the mental trauma that went along with experiencing that was significant. And so women do need to be aware of that. Certainly, this ruling places control back to the FDA, and so we applaud that. And this should be in the hands of medical professionals who know the true risks that go along with this medication. And I would hope that any future administration, if they do really care about women and women's health, would keep these common sense regulations in place to protect women from the harms that can go along with this medication, along with preborn children that are obviously killed by this medication.
Well, Dr. Francis, thank you so much for coming on, and thank you for your analysis. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Up next, Pope Francis has a message on praising God and not just in happy times. Now, since the beginning of our newscast, there is developing news to report. The House of Representatives has voted to impeach President Donald Trump. Lawmakers were split largely along party lines, but in the end, Democrats had enough votes to impeach the president for incitement of insurrection. President Trump becomes the first president in U.S. history to be impeached twice. Now the Senate will have to decide if he should be convicted and banned from running for office again. In other news, we are learning the Vatican Secretary of State approved the controversial purchase of a real estate property in London. In a March 2019 letter, which was recently leaked to an Italian newspaper, Cardinal Pietro Parolin wrote to the president of the Vatican Bank asking for a loan to pay off a mortgage on the property. This comes while Pope Francis is in the process of cleaning up the Holy See's finances. Joining us now with more information is EWTN News Rome correspondent Colm Flynn. Colm, good to see you. So tell us, what was written in that letter?
Good evening, Tracy. Well, this letter reveals that Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Secretary of State of the Vatican, he was aware and approved of the highly controversial purchase of a luxury real estate property in London, which is now at the centre of a Vatican investigation. Now, the exact figure is unknown, but it is believed that this property investment cost the Vatican hundreds of millions of euros. In the leaked letter, which is marked confidential and urgent and addressed to Jean-Baptiste de François at the Institute of Religious Works, otherwise known as the Vatican Bank, Cardinal Parolin asked for a loan of 150 million euros. That's approximately $182 million. Now, the money, he said, was needed to pay off the loan which had been taken out to buy shares of the real estate in London. And Cardinal Parolin in the letter describes the investment as a valid one, and that this foreign investment required confidentiality, and so they needed to acquire additional liquidity to safeguard the investment. He also stated that the Secretariat of State required the money to prevent it from dipping into its own reserves. Now, at the end of the letter, Cardinal Parolin offered his gratitude to the Vatican Bank if it approved the request.
Colm, do we know, was the money released by the Vatican Bank?
Well, Tracy, the Vatican Bank immediately moved to fulfill the request and informed the Supervisory and Financial Information Authority. They approved the loan as the Vatican Bank had enough money to cover it, but it was ultimately blocked by Gianfranco Mammi, the Director General of the Vatican Bank, who went on to file a complaint to the Vatican's promoter of justice. Now, Tracy, it's important to note that there is no indication that Cardinal Parolin is accused of any wrongdoing in this at this current time.
And Colin, before I let you go, where do things stand with the Secretary of State?
Well, Tracy, Cardinal Angelo Becciu was working directly under Cardinal Parolin at the Secretariat of State, and he was largely blamed for this debacled London property deal. He was dismissed by Pope Francis, and he's been contesting his innocence ever since. But this is the first time that Cardinal Parolin, who is the second in command at the Vatican, has had his name officially linked with the deal. And of course, on December the 28th, the Pope did make the surprise announcement that he was stripping the Secretariat of State of all its financial assets and real estate assets and moving them to another office. Now, the London property at the centre of all of this, it's owned by an Italian investor. He went on to make a substantial profit from the deal, while, of course, the Vatican lost millions. The investigation continues. Tracy?
Okay, thank you so much, Colm. Colm Flynn, EWTN News Rome correspondent.
Thank you, Tracy.
And finally tonight, Pope Francis says that we should praise God even in the most difficult times.
Lodare è come respirare ossigeno puro.
At his weekly talk in the Vatican, the Holy Father says worshiping God is like breathing in pure oxygen. And even when we feel like failures, he is our faithful friend who never leaves our side. Pope Francis also calls us to read the lives of the saints. They can teach us how to praise God in good times and in bad. We thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Tracy Sable. Good night and God bless.